There was a woman at my father's funeral that no one in my family had ever seen before. She stood at the very back, in a dark gray coat, holding the hand of a teenage boy. And when she finally came up to me, after almost everyone else had gone, she said 7 words that took the family I thought I had and broke it cleanly in half. She said, "I was married to him too, but I'm getting ahead of myself." Because to understand why those 7 words landed the way they did, and why the real shock of this story wasn't even her, you need to understand the man we were burying. Or rather, the man I thought we were burying. My father's name was Walter. He died on a cold Thursday in March, of a heart that simply stopped at 68 years old. And if you had asked me, the day before that funeral, to describe him, I would have given you the most ordinary answer in the world. He was a quiet man, a steady man. He worked in regional logistics, the kind of job nobody can ever quite explain at parties. And for as far back as I can remember, that job had taken him away from home for 2 weeks out of every single month. 2 weeks home, 2 weeks away. My entire childhood ran on that rhythm, as reliable as the tide. When I was a boy, I hated it. I'd count the days until he came back. And then, the morning he'd leave again, I'd watch him put his one gray suitcase in the trunk of his car, and I'd feel the house go a little quieter, a little colder, for 2 weeks. My mother, her name was Patricia, never seemed bothered by it. "That's just your father's work," she'd say, in a voice so flat and final that you learned, very young, not to ask a second question. That's just how it is. And that was how it was. For 30 years. The trips, the gray suitcase, the half a father I grew up with, gone as often as he was there. I made my peace with it the way children make peace with anything, by deciding it was normal because it was all I knew. He was a good man in the time he was there. I want to say that clearly before everything else, because everything else is going to complicate it. He taught me to drive. He came to the games he was in town for, and he was genuinely, quietly sorry about the ones he missed. He had a way of putting his hand on the back of your neck when he was proud of you that said more than he ever could out loud. I loved him. I never doubted, for 1 second of my life, that he loved me. I just didn't know him. I was about to find out that almost no one did. The funeral was small. Walter wasn't a man with a wide circle. My mother sat in the front row, dry-eyed and composed in the way she did everything, accepting condolences with a series of small, correct nods. My wife held my hand. The minister said the things ministers say about a man he'd met twice. And I spent the whole service staring at the photograph of my father propped beside the casket, thinking about that gray suitcase, and feeling the particular guilt of a son who realizes, too late, that he never asked his father a single real question. I noticed the woman during the eulogy. She was at the back, like I said, gray coat, a composure on her face that mirrored my mother's so exactly that, for a strange, disorienting moment, I thought they must be sisters. Beside her sat a boy, 15, 16 maybe, in a black suit that didn't quite fit him, the way funeral suits never fit teenagers. He was crying, not politely, really crying, the way you only cry for someone who is central to your life. And I remember thinking, who is that boy crying for? Because I didn't recognize a single feature of the woman. But the boy, there was something about the boy I couldn't place, and it bothered me all the way through the burial, the way a word you can't remember sits on the tip of your tongue. It was only later, when the crowd had thinned to almost nothing and my mother had been led to the car, that the woman approached me. Up close, she was perhaps 50, tired around the eyes, and kind. That was the thing that confused me most in the moment. She didn't look like a woman with a bomb in her hands. She looked like a woman who was very, very sad and very afraid of what she was about to do. "You're Daniel," she said. Not a question. "You look just like him at your age." I told her, politely, that I was sorry, but I didn't think we'd met. I asked how she'd known my father, and she looked at me for a long moment, and her eyes filled, and she said the 7 words. "I was married to him too." I actually laughed. Just a short, reflexive sound, the kind you make when your brain refuses the first delivery of something. I thought I'd misheard. I thought she was confused. Grief does strange things. Maybe she had the wrong funeral, the wrong family, the wrong man. Then she looked over at the boy in the too big suit, who was watching us from a few feet away with red, swollen eyes, and she said, gently, "Daniel, that's Sam. He's your brother." And I looked at the boy properly for the first time. and I finally placed the thing that had been bothering me all afternoon. He had my father's eyes. Exactly. The same shape, the same color, the same way they sat under the brow. The eyes I saw in the mirror every morning of my life. There was no mistaking it once I'd seen it. You cannot fake that. The boy crying at the back of my father's funeral was, unmistakably, my father's son. I don't remember what I said. I remember the woman, Helen, her name was Helen, pressing a piece of paper into my hand with a phone number on it, and saying she was sorry, she was so sorry to do it like this, but that I deserved to know, and that the boy deserved to not have to hide at his own father's funeral. And then she gathered Sam, and they left, and I stood alone in a draining cemetery, holding a phone number, with the entire foundation of my life quietly coming apart under my feet. 2 weeks home, 2 weeks away. I understood, standing there, exactly where my father had been for 2 weeks out of every month for 30 years. He hadn't been in regional logistics. He'd been in another city, in another house, with another woman, and I would learn, eventually, another son. My father had 2 families, and he had kept them apart, perfectly, for 3 decades. Now, I want to tell you about the month that followed, because the month that followed is where this story becomes something other than what you think it is. Because I drove home from that cemetery certain of one thing, that my father was the worst kind of liar, a man who had betrayed my mother and me for my entire life, and that the woman in the gray coat was the proof of it. I was furious at a dead man. I had that specific, useless rage you can only feel towards someone who is now permanently beyond the reach of your questions. But I'm an organized person. It's how I handle pain. I gather facts, I put them in order, I try to make the chaos hold still long enough to be understood. So instead of confronting anyone, I started, quietly, to learn the truth. All of it, before I decided what to feel. And the truth did not cooperate with my anger. I called Helen, a week later, when I could trust my own voice. We met in a coffee shop halfway between her city and mine, while the rain ran down the window, and she told me the story my father had never been able to. She did not tell it like a mistress. She told it like a widow, because that, it turned out, is what she was. Helen had not been my father's secret affair. Helen had been married, first, to my father's younger brother, to my uncle, a man named Thomas, an uncle I had been told, my whole life, had died young before I was born in a car accident. That part, at least, was true. Thomas had died at 26. What I had never been told was that he'd left behind a young wife, Helen, who was at the time of his death 2 months pregnant, with no family of her own, no money, and no one in the world. No one except her late husband's older brother, my father. Walter came to me after the funeral, Helen told me, turning her coffee cup in her hands, not drinking it. Thomas's funeral, and he made me a promise. He said, "You will never be alone. I will not let Thomas's child grow up the way we grew up." And I didn't understand, then, what he meant by that. I learned later. She learned later, and so did I, that my father and Thomas had grown up in a household I'd never heard a single honest word about. A poor, hard, frightening household, with a father who left and a mother who couldn't cope. The kind of childhood that 2 brothers survive only by swearing to each other that they will never, ever let the family fall that far again. Walter had spent his whole life keeping that vow. And when Thomas died and left a pregnant widow with nothing, the vow became a person. 2 people, once the baby came. He tried to do it the normal way at first, Helen said. He tried to just help. Money. Visits. Being an uncle to my daughter. Because there had been a daughter first. I learned, Sam came much later. He wanted to do it out in the open. He wanted to bring me and the baby into the family, properly. To just be the good brother who took care of his brother's child. She stopped. And this is the part where the story turned. And turned again, and stopped being about my father at all. Your mother, Helen said carefully, would not allow it. I asked her what she meant. Patricia found out that Walter was sending us money, Helen said. Early on, the first year, and she gave him a choice. She told him that it would shame the family, that people would talk, that they would assume the baby was his, that it would ruin his reputation and yours before you were even born. She told him he could support that woman, if his conscience demanded it, but never openly, never as family. It had to be hidden, or it had to stop. Helen looked up at me. Your father chose to keep his promise to his dead brother, and your mother set the terms on which he was allowed to keep it. The terms were silence. I want you to sit with what that means, because it took me weeks to fully absorb it. The 2-week trips, the gray suitcase, the other house, the other life, all of the secrecy that I'd spent a week despising my father for, had not started as my father's lie. It had started as my mother's condition. She had known about Helen from almost the very beginning. She had not been a victim of a 30-year deception. She had been its architect. She had told my father, take care of them in the shadows, where no one can see, or don't take care of them at all. And my father, caught between a promise to a dead brother and an ultimatum from a living wife, had done the only thing his particular kind of stubborn honor would let him do. He'd built a second life in the shadows my mother drew for him, and he'd carried the weight of both, alone, for 30 years. The daughter grew up. Helen, against the odds, eventually found a kind of family in my father, real and quiet and constant, the 2 weeks a month that my mother permitted and pretended not to count. And many years later, long after anyone expected it, Helen and Walter had a child of their own. Sam, the boy with my father's eyes. Was that part still a betrayal? I've thought about it more than anything else. By the time Sam was born, what existed between my father and Helen had stopped being an obligation and become, simply, a life. A second marriage and everything but the law. So yes, there's a version of this where my father is still guilty, where the promise became a relationship, and the relationship became a deception my mother merely permitted rather than authored. But here's what I kept coming back to. My father never abandoned anyone. Not my mother, not me, not Helen, not Sam, not the daughter, not the dead brother whose vow started all of it. He held every single thread for 30 years, and he never let one of us fall. It nearly killed him to do it. Helen told me he'd aged a decade in the last few years, carrying it. He was not a man who betrayed his family. He was a man who refused to betray any of his families, even when the only way to do that was to lie to all of them. That's not nothing. That's not the same as a man with a secret apartment and a thrill. That's a man crushed flat between a promise and an ultimatum, choosing, every single month, to keep carrying both halves of a weight no one ever helped him hold. And the person who had handed him that weight, who had drawn the line that turned an act of family loyalty into 30 years of corrosive secrecy, was sitting in my mother's house, dry-eyed at the funeral, accepting condolences with small correct nods. Which brings me to the part of the story I least expected, the part where I learned what my mother was willing to do. Because while I had been quietly meeting Helen and learning the truth, my mother had been quietly doing something else. She'd been moving. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, she had already met with my father's attorney. She had already begun the process of settling his estate, fast, and in a very particular direction. Every account, every policy, the house, the savings, all of it routed to her, cleanly, before anyone else could so much as ask a question. And then I found the letter. My father, it turned out, had left a letter with his attorney. A sealed letter, with instructions that had been given to me, personally, in the event of his death. My mother, settling the estate, had been given it by the attorney, and had simply not passed it on. I only found out it existed because the attorney, an old and decent man, mentioned it to me by accident, assuming I'd already read it. When I asked my mother about it, she told me, without a flicker, that there had been no letter, that the attorney was confused. She lied to my face about my own father's last words to me, as easily as she'd lied, by omission, for 30 years. I got the letter anyway. The attorney, once he understood what had happened, gave me a copy. It was, after all, addressed to me. And I sat in my car, in the rain, and I read the last thing my father ever tried to say to me. The thing my mother had tried to make sure I'd never hear. I'm not going to read you all of it, but I'll tell you the shape of it. He confessed everything. Helen, Thomas, the promise, Sam. He did not make excuses. He said plainly that he knew he'd failed all of us by lying, and that he'd spent 30 years unable to find a way out of a trap that, he admitted, he had partly built himself by going along with it. But the heart of the letter was not a confession. It was a request. He asked me to do the one thing he had never found the courage to do while he was alive. He asked me to make it right, to make sure Helen and Sam were not erased, to see that Sam, my brother, a 15-year-old boy who had just lost his father and was being treated by the rest of the world as if he had never existed, was acknowledged and protected and given the share of things that a son is owed. I could not give him my name while I lived, my father wrote. I'm asking you to give him your family now that I cannot. He has no one to fight for him but you. Please be the brother to him that I was never allowed to let you be. So there it was, laid out in front of me in the rain. Two paths. On one side, my mother, who wanted the secret stayed buried, the estate kept whole, Helen and Sam written out of existence as cleanly as they'd been hidden in life. All I had to do to choose her path was nothing. Stay quiet. Take my comfortable inheritance and my comfortable story about a complicated father, and let a grieving woman and a fatherless boy disappear back into the shadow they'd always lived in. It would have been so easy. No one would ever have known. On the other side, my father's last request, and a brother. People ask me which I chose, and they expect it to have been a hard decision. It wasn't. The hard part wasn't the choosing. The hard part was everything I had to give up to choose it. I chose my father's letter. I went to the attorney with a copy, and I made sure the estate could not be quietly closed in the dark. I made sure Helen and Sam were named, not out of spite toward my mother, but because they were in every way that actually counts my father's family, and erasing them would have made me exactly the kind of person who had built this whole tragedy in the first place. I split what could be split. I gave my brother a share of our father, in the only form our father had left to give, and I lost my mother to do it. She has not spoken to me since. In her version of the story, I betrayed her. I chose that woman and that boy over my own mother. I dragged the family name through exactly the mud she'd spent 30 years protecting it from. She cannot see, or will not, that the mud was always of her own making, that the shame she feared was never my father's affair. It was her own choice to make loyalty into a secret. I grieve her, a little, even though she's still alive, because the mother I thought I had, the steady, composed woman at the front of the funeral, turned out to be the coldest person in this entire story. Colder than the man we buried. Far colder than the woman in the gray coat. But I gained a brother. Sam is 17 now. He has my father's eyes, and it turns out my father's quiet, and my father's way of putting his hand on the back of your neck when he's proud of you, which undoes me every single time. We are slow with each other, careful, two people building a bridge from opposite sides of a river our father drowned in. But we are building it. My kids have an uncle. He has, at last, a family that is allowed to know his name. And Helen, who walked into a hostile funeral in a gray coat to do the bravest, kindest thing I've ever seen a person do. Helen is in our lives now, openly, in the daylight, the way my father wanted 30 years too late. People hear this story and they ask me if I hate my father. And I understand why they ask. He lied to me for my whole life. He had a second family. By every easy measure, he's the villain of his own story. But I don't hate him, because I finally understand the difference between a betrayal and a burden. A betrayal is a thing you do for yourself, at someone else's expense. A burden is a thing you carry for someone else, at your own. My father's whole hidden life was a burden, an impossible one, handed to him by a dead brother's love and a living wife's pride, and he carried it until his heart literally gave out under the weight. He should have refused the terms. He should have been brave enough, decades ago, to drag it all into the light and let the family survive the truth. That was his failure, and it was a real one, and it cost all of us years we can't get back. But he never let go of a single one of us. And in the end, he found the courage on paper that he never found in person, and he handed it to the one person he trusted to finish what he couldn't. It's raining tonight. Sam is coming over on Sunday, and I think about my father and his gray suitcase, and his 2 weeks home and 2 weeks away, and I don't feel the rage I felt in that cemetery anymore. I feel something closer to awe and something closer to grief for a man who spent his entire life keeping a promise that everyone around him made impossible to keep. A woman I'd never met came to my father's funeral and told me he had another wife. She was the most honest person there. And the hardest truth of all wasn't the secret she carried into that room. It was the one my mother carried out of it.